And of course, this is years ago, so you can't identify the objects any further than they have tried, unless they do some kind of further refinement on the clarity of the images. But again, that would be speculation. So a bit of excitement because it's new information, but it's new information that takes us back to where it was most likely believed the plane wreckage would be.
And so the image resolution is not high enough or good enough to say exactly what these objects are, but presumably they're in a cluster formation or something, are they, to suggest that they could have come from the plane?
Yes, enough to make people think that they're from the plane. This is the plane went missing on 8th of March. There had been some work done on the images, I understand, but the work was only renewed or finalised recently. I would be speculating as to why work wasn't done on them earlier. It may be because of the lack of clarity of the images. It may be because they were looking for bigger stuff. The search had a lot more urgency about it back in 2014 for obvious reasons, and maybe they had to work with information they thought was more reliable. This could be seen as maybe a bit less reliable than the information they had back then. But, others might say that if they'd looked at this back then, maybe they would have been looking somewhere else than the place they did look and didn't find the plane. So, that's for others to judge. But, I guess we are probably marginally a bit closer to more answers in terms of what happened to the plane, but I would suggest still a long way from answers that would satisfy anybody.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what is the next step from this? Where are analysts saying that this is going to lead? What's the next step?
Well, it's up to the Malaysian government to decide whether there should be another search. There's been a few freelancers that have suggested they want to go out and do it. But, of course, these things require money, and you probably want a search area that's perhaps not as big as the last one. I mean, you don't want to go through life without knowing what happened to this plane, not just for the loved ones, but this is most important for the family and friends of the loved ones who died, but also, future use of planes of this type. All of those things come into play. So this more comprehensive analysis that's been done regarding the drift modelling and the satellite imagery has come up with something that may, hopefully, perhaps encourage decision makers to say, yes, let's go down this path. But that needs to be balanced up against the fact that the Transport Minister, Darren Chester, has said that it's important to note that there's not new evidence in this information leading to a specific location.
That was David Webber from the ABC in Perth. Back home now, and high-speed passenger trains could link Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga and eventually Rotorua under a plan promoted by a transport lobby group. The group is Greater Auckland. They're saying that an initial service could start using refurbished Silver Fern rail cars, and in 5 years a fleet of high-speed tilt trains could link not only the centres but the smaller towns that are along the existing tracks. Auckland correspondent Todd Nile has been looking at this plan and joins me now. Good morning to you, Todd. This group, how closely have they looked into this idea?
Well, they've done a lot of work. There's an 80-page report. They've essentially tried to build a business case with financial data in it as well for what's effectively an Upper North Island regional rail network. It's got 3 stages. It starts quite modestly by refurbishing those old Silver Fern rail cars that used to trundle between Auckland and Wellington. They're 45 years old, but a $10 million refurbishing they think would get the thing going. Just basically Auckland, Hamilton down to Tauranga. Stage 2 is where the money starts to kick in, $400 million, some new stations, a new fleet of 17 high-speed tilt trains. These are trains that can run on the existing tracks but travel fast because they themselves tilt around the corners. And then the ultimate thing further down the track is nearly $1.5 billion, where there's more trains. There's extending it down to Rotorua. There's a line down to Cambridge, and so it becomes quite an expansive network. And the argument is that more than half of the country's population lives in that area, the Upper North Island, and that if you get in with passenger rail, that will help shape how most of the country's future population growth is going to go. And the group's spokesperson, Patrick Reynolds, says, it's not just Auckland focused, that there's an economic development argument for towns such as Huntly, Morrinsville and Te Kuiti.
They need to get a new development model, economic development model, and this is a program that's absolutely focused on them and suits them. And it's not necessarily about just getting to work in Auckland or even Hamilton, but intra-regional travel as well.
It's quite an interesting idea, isn't it? What are the routes and the services look like in the plan?
Well, they've done all their arithmetic based on, for example, Auckland to Hamilton, a fare being $20 and down to Tauranga $35. Initially, with the rail cars, they're suggesting that it could be 2 return peak in each peak time of day between Auckland and Hamilton, 1 down to Tauranga. Travel time to Hamilton, 2 hours, 15 minutes. In that next stage, once you get the faster trains and more of them, you'd have an hourly service between Auckland and Te Kuiti with a running time of 2 hours and 15 minutes then. And then, the big step up into stage 3, you could get to Tauranga in just over 2 hours' time. So, some quite impressive looking journey times if this was to happen.
Has anyone looked at trying to do this before?
Yeah, I mean, there have been various attempts to get an Auckland to Hamilton commuter rail service off the ground. There were the rail cars running for a while back in the early 2000s down to Tauranga. But to make this happen, if you're working from the ground up brick by brick, you need an awful lot of bricks to make it happen. And so Patrick Reynolds says because it spans several regions, they think it needs to be picked up by a national entity.
In some ways, the biggest problem is because there's a lack of a national structure looking at rail. The immediate reaction from every local government source is, well, the other lot will pay for it. So it really is a thing that our central government has to actually govern centrally and come in over the top.
So this is an idea, it's just out of the bag. They've yet to canvass it around the regions, and they've also, of course, got to canvass it with the government, which is probably where the action would happen if it was to roll out the way they envisage it.
Hey, thanks, Todd. It's an interesting idea. It'd be quite interesting to get listener feedback on this one too. 2101 is the text message if you want to reach us. Morning Report at radionz.co.nz is our email, and Twitter on NZ Morning Report. 13 to 8.
Well, it's marginally more affordable to buy your first home than it was 2 years ago, and renters in Auckland are also slightly better off. Well, that's according to the latest Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment figures. These figures also show almost 2/3 of Auckland renters would have less than $220 left over every week if they bought a house. Now, that's got Labour's housing spokesperson Phil Twyford worried, and he's in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning, Susie.
So these figures, it would appear, looking at the graphs in front of me now, that this is essentially stagnating, but at a very high rate.
That's my take on it too. The shocking thing, I think, is that nationwide 77% of renters really have no chance of ever owning a home of their own, according to the latest data. 60% of renters actually really struggle to pay the rent without going into financial hardship. And that's pretty serious and pretty worrying.
Let's just talk about the figures a little bit further, though, because if you do look at every single one of these graphs that MB has put out, it is high. It is almost level, but each one of them is actually dipping. So is this an indication that marginally this is going in the right direction?
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple of things going on here. One is that for a large part of the last 9 years, it's been a story of Auckland versus the rest of the country. And what we've seen, I think, in the last year or so in Auckland is what most commentators see as a temporary cooling in the Auckland market. And it's partly a result of the Reserve Bank lending restrictions, but the market has cooled a little bit. There are far fewer sales. Prices haven't moved much. Most people think that's going to be temporary, including the Reserve Bank, because the fundamentals haven't changed. In the rest of the country, actually, since this data set, the snapshot was taken, in many parts of regional New Zealand, we're seeing extreme rises in housing affordability and homelessness.
Between renters and owners, then, is there becoming much more of a gulf and much more of a sense that there are people who will be renting long term? And if so, is there anything wrong with that?
Well, I think unless we see a change of government and some serious policy change, that's the direction we're heading. The dream of home ownership will be gone forever for 2/3 of the population, according to this data. So, look, the thing about this data, there's not much change from what was released a few months ago, but actually the shocking thing is this just shows how serious the housing crisis is. It is appalling. The country needs something different.
OK, something different. Let's talk about what Labour could potentially offer then. How would you fix this? Capital gains tax?
It needs an approach that is committed to tackling the causes of the housing crisis, not tinkering around on the edges. So we need to tax speculators, and we've put a number of policies out there, extending the Bright Line test out to 5 years so that speculators would pay income tax on the capital gain on a rental property that they sell within 5 years. Changing the rules, the tax breaks for speculators.
OK, so wholesale capital gains tax, you're saying that wouldn't be something that Labour would do in a first term?
We've said that we'll do comprehensive tax reform. We'll set up a tax working group in our first term with a mandate to design a tax system that is fairer and more efficient and tilts the playing field away from property speculation. But look, it's not just about tax. We have to get government back into the business of building large numbers of affordable homes. That's in large part what will fix this problem.
It is, though, but let's just talk a little bit further about tax, because it sounds, when you're saying that there's going to be this overhaul of the tax system, that does sound like you may well be thinking that bringing in a capital gains tax would actually be the sort of thing that a Labour government would want to do.
Well, I think our finance spokesperson Grant Robertson and Jacinda Ardern have made it very clear that they're not ruling anything out and they're not ruling anything in.
But don't, at this stage of the cycle, don't people need to know what your take is, what the likelihood is, even if it's not a question of making a promise or campaigning on something, because people need to know ahead of going to the ballot box, don't they?
Well, that would undermine our commitment to an open, public and transparent process in government to look at the options for making a tax system that's fairer and more efficient. And we'll do that not on the basis of cherry-picking one person's favourite tax, but actually looking at the entire system. So that's our commitment on tax.
Is it that you don't want to frighten the horses, though? You don't want to say capital gains tax because you don't think that's something that will be a vote winner?
No, we want to do the job properly. And we'll do that properly in government, looking at the whole system. You know, the bias in the economy towards speculation in residential real estate is only just, it's one problem in the tax system. So it would be silly just to focus in on that. You've got to look at it in the whole. But it's not just about tax. We have to build more houses. We have to reform the planning system to allow our cities to make room for growth. And we have to stop this crazy sell-off of state housing and build thousands of extra state houses. That's what Labour will do.
Just one final area. What would you want to see as the number? Because the number here is that 77% of first home buyers have less money left over for food, clothing and bills than the national average for all households. 77% is where it is now. What would you want it to be after one term of a Labour government? I
want to see that dropping consistently, and I'm confident with our bold housing reforms we will actually achieve that. We will make the dream of Kiwi home ownership much more affordable to a much bigger group of people.
Thank you very much for your time today. That is Phil Twyford, Labour's housing spokesperson. 7 to 8.
Well, staying with homes, Wellington City Council is launching a voluntary rental warrant of fitness for minimum housing standards in the capital. Landlords will be able to